So, serving for Citi and Bank of America, as well as for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I'd like to welcome John Bottega. Over to you.
Thanks, Carol. I think, unbelievably, I think it's coming on 40 years, not 30 years of experience. Been in the industry a long time. So thank you, Carol, and again, welcome everyone. We've got a really interesting discussion planned for you today. Important topics of privacy and data protection. I'm excited to be joined by two industry experts who I'll introduce in a moment. So let me begin by kind of setting the stage. In this rapidly growing world of digital enterprise, more and more of our information, data about ourselves, our likes and dislikes, our preferences, our habits, are being captured, stored, analyzed, and shared. Now, given this reality, issues of data privacy and data protection are becoming front and center for all of us, but especially the data professionals, their organizations, and industry regulators. Similar to the Hippocratic oath that lawyers must commit to, it seems nowadays that data professionals are being asked to take a similar commitment of responsibility, that they'll respect the public's privacy and protect the public's data. Now, in today's panel, we're going to talk about how organizations are dealing with this new reality. What does it really mean to protect a customer's data? What does it mean to respect a customer's privacy, yet craft products and services that are custom fit for them? Who's responsible for this within organizations? What is the role of the Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Privacy Officer? And what role is the Chief Data Officer playing in all of this? So joining me this morning on this topic and addressing these questions are Sheila Fitzpatrick, Data Privacy and Sovereignty Law Expert at Fitzpatrick and Associates, and Jeff Brown, Chief Information Security Officer, Board Advisor and Speaker for the state of Connecticut. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Sheila, I'm going to start with you. So I had an opportunity to look at your extensive career. You've worked with many companies in all industries across the globe, including companies such as Oracle, PeopleSoft, General Motors, Deutsche Bank, British Aerospace, just to name a few. Well, you must have seen a lot of personal and private data come across those systems. What drew you to be focused on data privacy? And what attracted you to this topic? And can you give us a brief perspective of data protection and data privacy? You know, what's similar about them and what's different?
Sure, I'm happy to. So thank you, John, and thank you everyone for attending. So I started my career, you said you've been in it 40 years. I actually have been in the world of data privacy with an expertise in 160 countries for over 40 years. But I like to tell people I started at the age of 5 because they can all do the math now. And I started out my career actually in international employment law, and quickly working with multinational companies, quickly fell in love with the privacy side because it was an area that no one was focusing on. And to be perfectly honest, up until about 5 years ago, no one was really focusing on privacy. So I had 35 years head start on everyone else. And the reason why I really am very passionate about the subject is that I think individuals don't take a really deep dive into what organizations are doing with their data. And it used to bother me when I'd go into organizations and they'd ask for all types of personal data that really had no relevancy to what was going on. And anytime I would talk about, well, why do you need that data? And the response would be, well, don't worry about it because we need it either to provide a better user experience or to manage our relationship with you or to manage our customers or to manage our employees. And I would continually question, but what's the relevancy of the specific data that you're asking for? And the answer was always, well, we protect that data. You know, we make sure that we have the right security in place. And I would say, well, that's great, but that's not privacy. So you're still not answering my questions. So as more and more I got into it, and well before even the EU directive came out in 1998, I was into the privacy space. And really focused on how should individuals think about their own personal data and how should organizations think about that data. So my career has been very long and vast, and I don't really think of it as a career. I think of it as a passion. And for those who have heard me speak before, I am incredibly passionate about privacy. It does drive me insane when I see a lot of sort of non-privacy people jump on the privacy bandwagon. What they're really talking about is security. And you asked, what's the difference between privacy and security, or what's my view? I always like to use the analogy of, if I see privacy as the full life cycle of the data, from the time you collect it to the time you destroy it. And one very critical component of privacy is security. But if you're only focusing on security, you're literally locking down data you're not legally allowed to have, because you haven't done your privacy due diligence. You haven't thought about, what data do you need? What are you doing with it? And what's your lawful basis for processing it? How long are you maintaining it? Because records retention is a key and critical part of privacy. So I use an analogy that everybody that's heard me speak has heard this, but it sort of resonates. And I always say, if I go down and I rob the bank down the street, and I bring that money home and I lock it in a vault in my house, and I have cameras everywhere and I have a security system, when the police come knocking on my door, they're not going to care that I have the best security system in the world. They're going to care that that's not my money that I'm protecting. And you have to think about data the same way. If you haven't done your privacy due diligence and built that strong privacy program and have defined what you need, why you need it, what you're doing with it, vetted your third parties, et cetera, the security is not going to help you, because it's literally just locking down data, as I said, that you can't legally have. Doesn't mean security is not important. It is important, but it's not privacy. So,
well, you've given me the springboard to introducing Jeff as our Chief Information Security Officer. I clearly, we can't live one without the other. I think that's your point.
Yes.
But I love the comment you made about, we're asked for everything, and why. I was with a colleague just recently, actually going back into Manhattan. It's good to get back into Manhattan physically, right? And we went up to the security desk and they take a picture of you. And the person asked, "What are you doing with my picture?" And I was shocked by that question. I never thought of that. Is it going to be destroyed? Is it going to be kept? So asking those questions about where these things go, and photography is data, right? I mean, it's everything.
Absolutely. And I ask that question too when I go into buildings. They take my picture, and half the time I say, if you can't tell me what you're doing with it, I don't want my picture on there.
Yeah. It was an interesting kind of awakening to go, wow, we do ask for this stuff all the time. Well, Jeff, let me turn to you. So you too, Jeff, you've had a great and long career in data protection, many years in the private sector, and now you're with the public sector for the state of Connecticut. So I lived both lives. I lived both in the public and private sector over my career. And I found that having that perspective, both sides of the desk, was invaluable in my career. In your experience, can you tell us a little about your career journey, and what do you see the differences between public and private sector when it comes to a focus on information security or data protection?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I actually was educated in communications. So I have a very different kind of background. In fact, I recently just put a book out about security and communications and how they intersect, because I think it's very important. But 25 years I've spent at mostly financial institutions. In fact, we do share city together. I worked at Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, AIG, a number of different firms like that. And then, as you said, just recently took the role as the first CISO for the state of Connecticut in the public sector. So that's an interesting move for me. It's just a fascinating job, right? I think for what we do as CISOs, it doesn't really get more interesting than working at a state government, because it's like being in every single industry. We have financial services with the Department of Banking and Department of Revenue. We have Department of Transportation. We have all these different things that cross so many different industries, including healthcare. And really, like, how we treat data is very important. In fact, I think that a lot of the way that we've been doing things, I'd actually point to something called P20Win, which in Connecticut is really just an outstanding example of how to protect information. And really, that is an effort that shares information across agencies, right? And it's P20 really stands for, preschool through grade 20, if you will. Really, like, what they did with that was taking a really like a data-centric view of things and not making copies of data all over the place. So really, like, there's a formal request process. People ask for certain data fields, not for everything. And then we're not making copies of this stuff all over the place, because where security really comes in, we have to protect that. So as people start creating data lakes and all these like things that are all over the place, the same information replicates everywhere, and it becomes that much harder to protect. We've kind of talked a little bit about security and privacy. It's kind of like you can't really have privacy without security, but you can have security without privacy. So there is sort of a Venn diagram in there, but I can give you an example of a few things that we like doing in security that is very difficult to do on a global scale. Things like monitoring users. That is obviously a lot of, kind of privacy. It's very difficult to roll out things like data leakage prevention in the European Union. You have to go country by country, work councils, approvals, all these kind of things. Whereas in America, I feel like we haven't really moved that far away from, what was it? I think Scott McNeely from Sun Microsystems at the time, we have no privacy, get over it. Yeah. I feel like we haven't really moved that far away from that in the US. We have a hodgepodge of legal rules, and it's just not very clear. And I'm hoping that that is something that kind of switches over time. But that's sort of how we look at things. I think protecting citizen data in the state is critical for us. I'm really very interested actually in the way that we've kind of done a few things where we're just not replicating that data. We are really making sure that there's a business need for the data. Where it can be, it should be anonymized. And there's problems with anonymization as well. I mean, in some cases you can kind of reverse that, but like what we need to move away from my view in privacy, and again, I'm not a privacy expert, I'm a cyber expert, but this whole concept of we're going to collect everything and then try to pull, information out of that giant, puddle of information that we have all over the place. My view is actually, I've been sort of evangelizing in the state as well as some of the financials that I've worked at, is this concept of sort of data as a liability. The more you have, if you don't need it, you have to protect it. If it gets breached, you have to make notifications. It's like, do you really need that data in the first place? So we look at things like, I did a project with call centers where it was like, does a person sitting at a call center in your organization, do they really need to see credit card numbers and things like that? That can frankly be monetized on the dark web. Do they need to see that, or do they need to see that you have an active credit card on file, right? That's really all they need to see. So like, really taking this kind of least privilege approach with things and making sure that, that we are somewhat kind of treating data as a liability. And when you do that, security becomes easier. I would give an example of PCI compliance or payment card industry. This is for anybody who collects credit card information. The key to passing a PCI audit is generally tokenizing the data so that it's nowhere and everything suddenly becomes out of scope. Again, it's really, where do you absolutely have to have that data? Who actually in the company needs access to it? And then security can really help enforce some of the privacy.
You mentioned the point about liability, which is really interesting perspective. And immediately I think of the retention requirements. And in general, my experience has been that firms don't respect, well, maybe I don't know if that's the right word, or they don't adhere to the retention requirements, and they keep data well beyond the retention period of time. From a firm perspective, that has legal liability issues, right? Because data is discoverable in a lawsuit and so forth and so on. But I think the point you're making, Jeff, is that data can also be compromised. Yeah. Right. So is the advice, and I guess both Sheila and Jeff, if you don't need it, get rid of it, right? Destroy it, because you could be compromising both privacy and the protection.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a key issue, is the fact that, I mentioned earlier, records retention and destruction is a key component of data privacy laws. Very few records are permanent records. There's no reason to maintain data longer than is needed for the purpose for which it was collected, or for if you have a legal or statutory requirement to collect it. And so it's very, very critical. And when I work with different organizations, whether they're public or private sector, the issue always becomes, I need to see your records retention policy. And it's like, well, we never get rid of anything. It's like, what do you mean? I mean, just the cost of e-discovery can destroy an organization if there's any type of liability, or if you have a data breach or privacy incident and you have to provide the data, you're going to get nailed, because the regulators are going to say, why do you even have this data? You haven't had a relationship with this individual in 5 years. So it's really key. Can I add one thing to what Jeff said that I really agree with? I completely agree with Jeff's perception and comment on the US and privacy laws. The US is so far behind the rest of the world. The fastest growing region in the world right now for privacy laws is Asia Pacific. And many of the new laws there are surpassing what we see in the EU, even the GDPR. And you hear people in the US continually talking about CCPA in California, or CPRA, or the Virginia Data Protection Act, or the Nevada Data Protection Act. And it's almost like a lot of consulting firms and law firms are trying to spin these up as the new GDPR. They are so far from being the new GDPR. It's not even funny. You don't have to have a lawful basis for processing the data. You don't even, the assumption is you're opted in until you choose to opt out, which is the opposite of the rest of the world. So I completely agree with Jeff in that, the US doesn't have an appetite for the type of privacy laws that we see in the rest of the world, which is very sad, in my opinion, obviously. And I don't see it changing anytime soon. I see security becoming, more and more talked about. It's always been a critical issue, but I still don't see privacy as where it should be.
Sheila, in fact, talk about timing. As you just started to answer that, a question came in and said, in Europe, we have GDPR standards. Are these not applicable or followed in the US? If not, what is equivalent? So you ended up answering the question before it came out. So fantastic timing on that.
There is no equivalent in the US, unfortunately.
But I did want to just ask a question about that. So we're seeing legislation appear, and whether it's strong or not, it's popping up in the US, it's popping up in Europe. We're seeing in South America, there are laws now coming in on privacy and so forth. And from a data perspective, one use case I always find fascinating with GDPR is we think about data as being my social security number, my private area, or whatever. But if I'm applying for a job and I give you my resume, and what do we do with resumes routinely? We make 1,000 copies and send it to everybody. And now I turn around and say, I want my resume back. Do we have the technical capability to find all of that data and then, destroy it or, give it back? And I think that's both a technical issue as well as it is a policy issue, I would assume. Jeff, is that something that you see on the protection side in terms of tagging data and with proper metadata and things like that? Or is, how do you see that? And Sheila, again, what can we even achieve these things?
Yeah, certainly in the data leakage prevention space, DLP, that's something that a lot of people are really looking at. I mean, to get the real value out of those kind of systems, you need some level of understanding where your confidential data is, and those systems typically are working with like regular expressions and things that look like credit cards are very easy to find. What's not so easy to find is business strategy, M&A, all of the proprietary information in a firm. That kind of stuff is a lot harder to identify. I can tell you one place where that actually worked really well was one of the financials I worked at, where the global banking area had, fortunately for us, put a proprietary watermark in their financial models. And this was really like the secret sauce of the firm. Like if you could imagine, just take a random bank. If they understand exactly how you price a deal, they can come in and undersell you every single time, right? So this was a very sensitive, and impactful thing that was just, for us, it's impossible to look at. Like, what are you looking for? You have to be able to really describe exactly what you're looking for. And then these systems can help prevent that information from leaving and help protect it. having that watermark was really a great way that we were able to, kind of just step right in and show a lot of business value. And a lot of people complain with DLP. I don't want to get into a big DLP conversation here, but that's because they're not getting the value. It's check the box compliance, looking for credit cards, social securities, things that are just very, very obvious, and not really taking it to that next step where you're protecting business data.
Yeah. So we talk about, oh, I'm sorry, Sheila, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and then from a privacy perspective, going back to the model that you used, or the example you used on resumes, organizations certainly have the responsibility of ensuring that if you're not hiring someone, that you have to state how long you're maintaining that data, and the individual does have the right to request that data be destroyed or returned to you, and you can't keep copies of it. You can anonymize it as long as it's truly de-identified. But that becomes an issue, especially when you say, multiple copies of the data. And that's certainly an issue when you start talking about cloud environments. So if you're storing the data in a cloud, companies might say, well, our primary storage location is Germany, our backup is, France. But they never talk about the fact that if those data centers go down, most cloud providers are US providers. That data sits in the US, it's accessible in the US. It might be accessible in India if they have a 24/7 support system. So you have multiple copies of these data in multiple systems, and there's no transparency around that. And that's a major problem.
So I definitely want to talk about cloud, but I want to ask one more question on this, on the regulation side of things. We're seeing obviously a lot of, I'll call it defensive regulations, right? You must do this, you must do that, auditable and so forth. But on the flip side, we're seeing more actions by governments to make data accessible. So the Open Data Act in the States, the Evidence Act, which said all government agencies have to be better at data management. And now we have the Financial Transparency Act that's being discussed. So how do you manage that yin and the yang? Make data available, but protect it and respect privacy. So do you see that in your challenges, those two forces kind of going against each other?
Yeah, I certainly do, especially when you're talking about jurisdictions that have less restrictive privacy laws like the US, where data is gold, and where I hate that expression, but everybody talks about data being gold and the need for it. You don't see it as much in Europe, in Canada, in Latin America, Asia Pacific, because there's much more restrictive data privacy laws. And so making sure that you're having data made available as needed really requires that transparency around why do you need it, what do you need, what's the lawful basis for doing it? Because if you don't have a lawful basis for processing that data, then you're violating the law. And what do the individuals know? And do you really need identifiable data to build the models you're trying to build, or to share the data? Do you need actual individual data, or can you use more statistical and aggregate data? And I run into that issue all the time, especially when I'm talking to data scientists, and they say, we need the data. And I go, you don't need the data. You need, information, aggregate, statistical data. You don't need to know it's Sheila Fitzpatrick's data. And that does become sort of a yin and yang, where they're continually competing. You see it much more in the US than you do elsewhere. And that becomes a problem when they're multinational companies based in the US that want to use the data of their European customers or European employees, in the same, in Asia.
Jeff, do you see a kind of a pull and push in your space where let's make data available from the public sector, but you have to remind them that there's some privacy and protection that you got to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. If you ever heard of the FOIA requests process, or Freedom of Information Act, that is something that we take very seriously. I mean, we want to run a transparent government. We want to be able to kind of show, some of the ways that we're governing the states, but we also do have to take some care. So we may, in some cases, we've actually gotten requests on things that might be very sensitive from a security perspective, like, specific firewall kind of information. And it's like, no, we can't do that. That compromises the security of the state. So we do have, some process where we will, make sure that, like, can we actually release this data? We try to strive to run a transparent government, but, at certain circumstances, you just kind of can't do that.
Do you find yourself in a mode of kind of teaching data literacy or privacy literacy, because I part of it, I think, is just awareness and education too, right? Of what can be done, what can't be done, and so forth. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
We're getting a ton of questions. I have one more question on this, and I do want to talk about the cloud. But this is just a straightforward question. Would the panelists recommend that the U.S. enact federal legislation for data privacy instead of the piecemeal state level legislation? Do you see that in the future, or is it possible? Or?
Well, I mean, that would be ideal. The problem that we're seeing today is there's not really an appetite from a federal level to implement a law that could directly impact business. The US is a very business-driven country as opposed to other countries that are more employee-driven. Not to say that they don't care about business, they do, but they take privacy very seriously. The issue I have with the federal approach today is that some of the biggest companies, biggest violators of privacy laws are some of the biggest companies in the US that have signed up to help develop and write the federal law. And there's no way I want a company that has been fined $60 billion and is continually abusing privacy laws around the world to be defining the privacy laws in the US. And the laws in the US still focus much more on security than they do on privacy. Even, the state laws are still, they're better, and I'm glad to see that they're happening. They still don't focus primarily on privacy. Again, as I said earlier, you don't have to have a lawful basis for processing it, but you have to be transparent and protect that data. So it's more security aspect.
So let me jump into a little bit of discussion on cloud. So, you can't go anywhere without talking about cloud. It's on our TVs, it's on everywhere, right? As I mentioned in the opening statement, this move towards digitalization has moved everything into the cloud. And if you read, various experts will predict by, I think it's 2025, nearly half. So think about that, 50% of all of our data is going to be in the cloud. Now, don't get me wrong, cloud brings huge technical capability and opportunity. But of course, if it's done incorrectly or it's done without the guidelines that we just kind of alluded to, bad things can happen. We introduce risk. So how is this move to cloud impacting data privacy and protection? What can firms do to ensure that both are being addressed? And Jeff, let me start with you from just a cloud data protection perspective.
Yeah, no, and it's a good question. I know for us, some of this was accelerated as the move towards digital government, it's happened, as well as the COVID pandemic. So we've really accelerated a lot of what we do with cloud. And from that perspective, that's a lot of moving pieces, right? We're putting things and processes that used to be on sites, kind of out now. For us, we actually use the government cloud for most things, not all, but most. So that has some specific security controls around it, which is, very helpful, I think, including where the data is stored and who has access to it on the either Microsoft or Amazon side. But really, I think a lot of what it comes down to is really, we need to do a better job, first of all, on security by default. So one thing that happens all the time, and people say they had like a cloud breach or cloud exposure, and typically what's happened is like you put, kind of just exposed data into an S3 bucket and everybody was able to get to it. That was 100% user error, right? Like, and they call it a cloud breach because the data was breached, but what really wasn't. Understanding, I think also the shared responsibilities model. A lot of people really just don't understand that. They kind of think like, oh, it's in the cloud, so everybody else takes care of it for us. There is a very good kind of depiction, and both providers, all the major providers have this, like, this is what we do and this is what you do. And in a lot of cases, they're just handling basic infrastructure kind of things. And then your data and your applications and all of the other things are your responsibility. So really making sure, I think, that people understand that. And then I think probably the last one I would mention is just educating the employees who are actually using the cloud. So there's no, when people just don't quite understand the technology that they're working at, and some firms have kind of said like, full speed ahead, let's go to the cloud, and then they haven't really educated the IT staff on how do they handle this.
That's a great point. Jeff, you're probably aware that the council completed a 1.5-year-long activity to develop what we're referring to as the CDMC, which is the Cloud Data Management Capability Framework. That was 100 companies, 300 individuals from all the major cloud providers and banks and organizations to build a framework around these are the things you should be doing in cloud before you even go to cloud, right? And it includes things like, protection and multi-cloud cataloging and proper metadata assignment and jurisdictional residency issues and all of that. So we feel in this activity, and we've talked to regulators on this, that we can see this becoming, similar to a SOC 2 compliance type of audit or any of these types of audits, that firms should be following a best practice, right, before they jump into cloud. I had an experience once, this goes back to the days of big data, where someone said, I want to do big data. And I said, why? Because I just read a story about it. They didn't want to hear why they wanted to do it. They just read it. And I think there's a bit of that. There's a bit of the herd mentality to cloud. And to your point, people have to be skilled in it, right? Or else you create risk. Yeah. Skilled from a privacy perspective. And I think that goes again to good data management, right? If we don't properly tag data, and so that how can Jeff know and his team to protect this asset class of data unless we properly identify it as sensitive?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you talk about, the new team that's been formed that has looked at the cloud, and maybe there's going to be a model, a standard of how to work the cloud. The thing that wasn't mentioned is privacy. Once again, they talk about protection, they talk about data sovereignty, they don't talk about the privacy aspects. And that's where the chief privacy officer and the CISO need to work hand in hand. That's where they're definitely partners. Because from a privacy perspective, you need, first of all, to decide what type of data should go into what type of cloud. Are you going to put highly sensitive information into a public cloud? Probably not. Have you done your privacy due diligence? Because a lot of organizations will conduct a very extensive security assessment of the cloud provider. They will not do a privacy assessment. They'll say, well, we ask a privacy question in our security assessment. That's not the same thing. There's like 60 questions that are privacy related you need to ask cloud providers. And the problem is, I'm not anti-cloud, so let's put that out there. I mean, the cloud has tremendous benefits. But what I see is the decisions are not based on privacy and business need as much as business need and security and IT issues. So what happens is the right questions aren't necessarily being asked. And it's, what I had mentioned earlier, the cloud providers are not the most transparent companies in the world. And that's part of the reason why, the new the standard contractual clauses you use in Europe when you're a US company and you want to put data in a cloud that contains European data and now Asia Pacific data, is that cloud providers tend to, and even Jeff mentioned this, sort of push responsibility for the data down to their customers. And the fact of the matter is, if they're hosting the data in their environment, they have liability and they have to comply with the data privacy laws. You need to know who in their environment has access to the data, where their data centers are, not just the primary and the backup, but where, if the data center goes down, where's that being accessed? Who in their environment has access to it? Where are their, call centers at 24/7? How do they comply with privacy laws? Have they had any privacy violations? So there's a whole series of privacy questions that need to be asked and transparency. And Europe, for instance, is becoming very frustrated with US cloud providers. And they've started an initiative, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's Gaia X, which is an initiative that there's 850 members and 425 companies involved. And it's to basically build a strategic, transparent, open, digital transformation in Europe using European cloud providers to get away from dependency on the US cloud providers who haven't abided by privacy laws. And so the push is really to have cloud providers in Europe that understand and comply with the data privacy laws and aren't these continual violations going on. And so I'm hoping that Gaia X will sort of push some of our big cloud providers here in the US to start paying more attention to privacy, not just saying the word, but understanding what it means.
Well, I'd say the good news is, and this is what was really very rewarding in the work that we did with the CDMC, it was an opportunity for the cloud providers to listen to the consumers, right? And the consumers identified the capabilities and features that they expect to see in cloud. Mm-hmm. And not only identify them, but we are actively working now with a number of partners to build automated routines to actually test whether these capabilities have been added. Yeah. And what's really been beneficial is the cloud providers sitting there going, I get it. If I do this, adoption to cloud becomes easier. I'm going to be more in compliance and so forth. So it's been a win-win on both sides. Long journey ahead, no question. Yeah. But I think that type of collaboration between the providers, the consumers, the regulators, and so forth is really what we need to, to propel this in a way that it's trusted environment. And like you said, it's not one or the other. It's got to be, together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And along those lines, I one of the questions I want to ask is, we talk about the cloud providers or the organizations or the companies, but in many, many cases, the data originates from us. It's our data. It's one of the probably the biggest problems we see in social media is people putting their personal information into environments that maybe aren't the best place to put that information. So my question would be to kind of turn the model around a little bit. What's our responsibility as the public when it comes to privacy and data protection? Like I think you said before, Sheila or Jeff, why are you asking me for this information? Should we be asking those questions more, or shying away from, retail outlets or whatever that keep asking us for all that information? What's your perspective on what we're supposed to do?
Yeah, absolutely. We have some accountability in there, because we should not be freely giving away information. If your gut tells you it doesn't make sense that they're asking for this information, don't give it. In the US, we continually get asked at different places for our social security number. By law, you don't have to provide your social security number unless it's for a government benefit. So it's like when you go to the hospital, you don't have to provide your social security number, but they ask for it and people think, oh, I have to. So it's educating yourself on what it is, what do they absolutely have to have in order to manage the relationship you have, whether it's with your social media company, whether it's with your doctor, whether it's with a retailer. What is the minimum amount of data they have to have in order to provide the service that they need to provide? So ask questions, be belligerent if you have to. I mean, when I go to a store and they say, can I have your phone number? And I say no. And they go, well, I have to have it. I go, no, you don't. What are you going to do with it? And they say, well, we're required to. The poor clerk is going, oh my God, this woman is a pain. But to say, well, the system requires it, or I can't get into the system. And I said, well, then I'll make up a number. Oh, but you can't do that because then we can't use it. Well, you just said you weren't going to use it. So you can catch them in certain things. And the other thing, too, that a lot of people do not do is they don't read the terms and conditions that they're checking the box to agree to. So if you don't read the terms and conditions, although that even if you check the box now under certain jurisdictions in Europe and in Asia, even in Canada, if you check the box, but you have no idea what you just agreed to, the terms and conditions are considered.
I have a use case I want to throw at you in a moment on that exact topic. But let me go to Jeff on this. Jeff, there's some examples where we've seen cloud implementations actually get compromised. And, from your perspective, would you say it was the technology that was compromised, or like you said, it was human error that got involved? I mean, there's certainly been enough headline examples. What's your perspective on where, I don't want to say the fault lies, I don't want to blame anybody, but, we're learning this stuff, right? But where are the weaknesses, I guess?
Yeah, I think some of the weaknesses are just in terms of settings by default. So I already talked a little bit about, like why are you able now today to still create these kind of big data dumps online? They're not encrypted. They have no access control. You have to configure that after, right? Like it's something you have to think about. So I think that's probably one of the big ones. A lot of times when we really look under the covers of, a quote unquote cloud breach, A lot of times it's either the application, which resides with the end users, it's configuration, which is a big one. And again, that's why you got to have your IT staff trained, right? Like, I mean, if they don't know what they're doing, they're going to make mistakes. The other thing too, especially in private industry, is you know, just it's easy to get things into the cloud, right? Like, I mean, you're able to just pull out a credit card, you know, set up an account, and it's not always easy to catch that. So in some cases, we had we actually had a process set up at one of my previous firms where we would look for corporate email addresses that had signed up with the cloud provider, and they would let us know that. But the reality is that, you know, you can also sign up with your Gmail account, and we're not going to catch that as easily. You know, so it's really a tricky balance, I think. But, you know, in terms of, you know, making sure that you do have a cloud process, because if IT becomes seen as like sort of a stumbling block, you're going to get shadow IT, and they're going to say like, you know, I'm just going to do this myself. I have a credit card, I have an Amazon account, and I'm going to just start putting data out there. You have to be able to do it in the right way. So making sure that you have those processes in place is really important.
So we've spoken about the technology, we've spoken about some of the laws and so forth, but what about culture? I mean, do organizations have to kind of shift their cultural perspective a little bit from, hey, data is important, these things are important, or is there still a struggle from a cultural perspective that we're not giving it its right importance, or it's, you know, like, are these issues hitting the board of directors or the C-suite? Do you see that sometimes a struggle in your experiences?
I would say so. You know, it's very difficult to get the right people to understand it. But usually when you get the business leaders, when you get the senior managers, you know, and they understand the risk, and that's really like our job, right? Like, we have to be able to explain what the risk is. You know, and when you do that right, I've found that 9 times out of 10, they do understand that. You know, there's always business pressure to get things out quick and time to market and all of those kind of things, but not too many people are really going to say like, yeah, let's take a gigantic risk with all our customer information that might result in us having to provide notifications that undermine the trust in the company. Not too many people are going to want to do that.
Is there an appetite for good data governance, like these toll gates that ask those questions before you know, the data goes up into I've never heard the expression puddle. I like that, the data puddle. So is there toll gates that protect that, or you know, are we able to enact those changes?
You know, easy in financial services, harder everywhere else. When you have a company like in finance where it's, you know, they're just heavily regulated, you know, you can't just move money around without processes. Everything is a process. There, it's relatively easy to do it. I do respect that in other industries, it's a lot more difficult. It's something that you have to sort of superimpose on what might be very, like, you know, a software company is going to run very freewheeling. A university is going to run very freewheeling. You know, trying to impose those kind of processes where there's really, frankly, no process across anything, that's really difficult.
This has been a great conversation. I guarantee we could talk about this for another hour. We have about 15 minutes total. I want to cut it to 10 so we leave some extra time. 2 more just quick things I want to touch upon. And one was going back to Sheila, to your point about the click-through, the famous click-through, right? You know, we all do it, right? Yeah, there we go. And we have no idea what we're clicking through. There is just a recent article printed on one of the DNA collecting companies, you know, my history, my, you know, lineage, all that stuff. And it turns out that they have been using this data for medical research. And when you read the story, it's to research a cancer cure. So, you know, on the onset, you said, that's fantastic. But from a privacy perspective, did I click through and said they could use my DNA for that? And, you know, what's the balance there?
Well, the organization that you're talking about, I know exactly what that is, and it will remain unnamed, but their terms and conditions did not state that. And they were taking advantage, and that's called the secondary use of data, which is one of the major violations in privacy, when you're collecting the data for one purpose, but then using it for a totally different purpose without the consent or the knowledge of the individual, depending on the lawful basis. And what's happened recently, not as a result of this, but with the GDPR, with the New Zealand Privacy Act, with Canada's new law, with China's, with Japan's new law, and so many others, is that if your terms and conditions are so convoluted that people do not understand what they're clicking through and they just click, that click is invalid, and that's considered a privacy violation. So when we think about privacy breaches or data breaches, we think about the traditional, intrusion into your environment, unauthorized access. But it's much more than that. So if you have fraudulent terms and conditions or unlawful basis for processing, or transfer data across borders without a lawful basis or without consent, there's various others. Those are also considered privacy incidences and breaches, and you can be fined substantially for that. And actually, some of the biggest fines that we've seen globally have been for companies that have fraudulent terms and conditions and policies. A lot of companies says, but our policy says. But if your policy violates the data protection law, your policies are invalid, and companies don't realize that. And that's become a big issue. So even if you clicked through, if it didn't, it's your fault for not reading it. But the good news is, if it's so convoluted and so difficult to understand, you will still be protected because they shouldn't be using your data.
So let me wrap up our conversation with one last topic, and I'm going to direct this first to you, Jeff. You and I both worked at a bank together in my first assignment as a chief data officer. And it's telling, because 15 years ago, I didn't know you, you didn't know me. So obviously the chief data officer and the chief information security never talked to each other. I would think that it's got to be different now. The CDO has to ensure that data is properly tagged and identified, and then the chief information security has to know how to see that and use it, and the privacy officer has to give guidelines. So let me wrap our discussion to both of you is, who are the players? How do we get them to work together in this ecosystem?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I would say that, first of all, back then, security really was kind of seen as a technology problem, right? So, I mean, this was some time ago, but I think when you fast forward now, one of the great things about just being a CISO is like the amount of communication that needs to happen across the entire company, the entire government, the entire everything, right? Like, so now when you fast forward, security's left the data center, and it is now something that has made it all the way up to the board of directors, right? So we do work very closely, with privacy officers, compliance officers, legal, but you also have to get into the business level too, right? So I think it's something now where it's just a very, very collaborative space. And the good news about that, though, is that, once you get these people together, it makes decision making a lot easier. So we in security no longer have to say, like, I don't know, is this important to the business? Yes or no. We don't have to make assumptions, and then we can really get it like right from the executives in terms of like what is important to the business and how should we protect this information.
So Sheila, it takes a village?
It definitely takes a village, and I happen to agree with Jeff. I mean, the business is critical. I look at it as, the chief privacy officer is responsible for ensuring compliance with all of the data protection laws out there, defining what data can be used, working with the business to understand their business needs around data, and then building the policies and procedures and administrative aspects of that life cycle of data. The CDO uses that data to build models. And so it's important that the CDO and the privacy officer are talking. So are you allowed to have that data or not? And certainly the CISO is a critical component, because not only are they providing the protection aspect and locking down that data, they're also there to assist with the technology solutions that all three should be talking about, because, the CDO might want one technology, CISO might want another, and privacy might come in and say, whoa, wait a minute, that's a third party we haven't even vetted. So the fact that they all work together is absolutely critical.
Sheila and Jeff, this has been a great dialogue. Thank you. Stay on, don't go away. I do want to invite in our sponsor today, Data Dynamics. Helen Johnson, if you are nearby, I know you want to say a few words. But again, thank you both. Great dialogue. In fact, you check your emails, because I might be shooting you some emails with some follow-up questions as well. By the way, we received a lot of questions. We didn't have time to answer them all. So it's usually our process where we try to get some answers to the questions we captured. So to everybody on the call. We'll try to get these out to everybody. So Helen, if you're there.
I am, John, thank you. And first, thank you, Sheila and Jeff, for doing this session for us. So guys, I just want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time out to joining us today. As an ex-chief data officer, as well as a CIO, security and privacy was huge in my last organization. So I find this topic very dear to my heart, and Sheila and Jeff are folks that I've worked for in the past in working together. And just to add,
I'm sorry, you're coming in with a lot of static. I don't know if others are hearing that. If you're hitting
sorry,
mic.
I don't know if others are hearing static.
Are you hearing that also?
A lot of static.
Yeah.
Okay.
Helen, let's make sure your microphone is clear from touching anything else, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's rubbing up against something.
It's not touching anything. I'm so sorry.
Stay right there. Don't move. Keep talking. You're good.
Stay where you are.
I won't move. I was just saying thank you to everybody for attending the session today. As an ex-chief data officer, as well as a CIO, this was a topic that was very dear to me in my last organization. And just to add to your last question, John, at my last company, we couldn't do our job as chief data officer. We couldn't actually help our business unit if we weren't working with the CISOs, the CPOs, the rest of our CDOs, because it does take a village. Because there's so many laws, there's so much complexities these days on how do you protect data, how do you manage data, keeping security and privacy in mind. There's no single person that can answer it all. So I do agree with Sheila and Jeff. Invite everybody to that table because you're going to come away with a much stronger data management strategy for your organization. And speaking of that, Data Dynamics, the company I'm currently with, is helping customers to create that data management platform. Because I'm so sorry. Because the reason why Data Dynamic exists is how do you understand what data that you have? Where is it stored? How do you tag it so that you can actually protect it as well as secure your data? So that's really it, John. I hope everybody had a wonderful time listening to Sheila and Jeff today.
No, it was great. So Helen, to you and to Data Dynamics, thank you for being our sponsor today. Sheila and Jeff, great dialogue. Sheila, I'm going to take you with me next time I go into an office building or whatever. So,
hey. It's a deal.
There we go. Very good.
Absolutely.
And to all the attendees and to our friends at Paragon who always help to coordinate all this. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. This has been recorded and will be made available on our website. So again, it's Wednesday, isn't it? Well, early weekend. Enjoy the weekend. Have a great time. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.